on today, December 7th, 2021. I want to welcome everybody, and I'll start off with having my colleagues introduce themselves.
Judy Daca, District 1.
Good afternoon, everyone. Shebra Evans, representing District 4.
Good afternoon, Hana Looney, student member of the board.
And I'm Rebecca Smondrowski, representing District 2 and chair of the Policy Management Committee. We have a very full agenda today, as everybody is aware. We'll start with the informational summary. Do any of you all have questions, concerns, or anything? No? All right. If none, then the summary would be approved. And we can jump right in with item number 3. And I will let you all take it away.
Good afternoon. We're starting with for discussion of policy ECA energy conservation. The Board Fiscal Management Committee referred policy ECA energy conservation to the Policy Management Committee for review earlier this fall. Staff from the Department of Facilities Management are here today to discuss their review of the existing ECA stakeholder engagement to prioritize recommended changes and their proposed draft for your review. I'll ask my colleagues from Facilities Management to introduce themselves as they walk through today's discussion.
Good afternoon. My name is Lynn Sarate, and I'm the Director of Sustainability and Compliance in Facilities Management.
Good afternoon. Seth Adams, Director of Department of Facilities Management. I guess we'll turn it over to Lynn now.
Thank you very much to the committee for hearing our proposal on how to transform our current policy ECA energy conservation to a policy that seeks to create a new culture of sustainability in Montgomery County Public Schools. Next slide, please. Currently, the Board of Education policy ECA establishes energy conservation actions and practices that will continue to preserve our natural resources while providing a safe and comfortable learning environment for all staff and students. This policy was adopted originally in November of 1973, amended in 1997, and reviewed in 2002. It established a basic framework for resource conservation, but in the interim years, there has been an evolution of the why, a shift in focus away from simply saving money towards more a concept of prevention of burdening future generations with the choices that we make today. An update to this policy is needed to provide a more comprehensive approach to encompass all areas of long-term sustainability and environmental stewardship, including but not limited to new approaches in energy and utilities, transportation, waste, facility innovations, and new pathways and funding to comply with recent and evolving local and state regulations. In addition, there's a new state regulation on school district energy use. This requires school districts to update their energy policies and encourages setting targets to increase the use of renewable energy and reduce school district greenhouse gas emissions. It requires updates every 3 years and has several other reporting requirements. At the same time, we want to take this opportunity to weave this into a much more comprehensive, system-wide approach to sustainability. Another relevant regulation is the Maryland Green Schools Act of 2019, which supports the state's effort to curb climate change and meet state environmental educational goals to increase the number of Maryland green schools across the state, and sets a goal to increase the number of green schools by 2025 to 50%. Montgomery County Schools is only at 42% currently. The last regulation that's relevant towards the update of this policy is the Montgomery County Climate Action Plan, which was published in June of this year. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the future slides, but in a nutshell, the county's Climate Action Plan sets educational goals for MCPS, as well as many new construction requirements. It's important to note that MCPS may not be subject to some of the requirements set forth in the Climate Action Plan, but it does contain more than 20 proposed actions where MCPS is given either a lead or contributing role. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, MCPS does have a very significant outreach and educational load in the Montgomery County Climate Action Plan. It also sets many new requirements that will be adopted by regulation by the county. The education actions include teaching and learning, integration of climate change education into existing curriculum, professional development both for educators and for staff, as well as enhanced outdoor learning. This revised draft policy emphasizes reduced greenhouse gas and energy consumption in support of the countywide targets towards greenhouse gas reduction. Next slide, please. In general, greenhouse gases result from the combustion of fossil fuels such as gasoline, diesel, natural gas, and coal. Consensus is that this is result in climate change. In our efforts to transform our culture of sustainability, it will be a comprehensive effort that includes both waste reduction and product use. But as you can see, the biggest impacts to greenhouse gases in the county are a result of building use and transportation. So the biggest impacts that we can take and make are to focus on the ways that we generate and use energy, how we heat and cool our buildings, how we fuel our vehicles, our consumption patterns, primarily in the building and transportation sectors. A part of developing the Climate Action Plan, there was a focus on building resilience, and significant student voice and public voice was a major factor in the Climate Action Plan. There's also a focus on climate risk reduction, racial equity, social justice, public health, environmental stewardship, economic prosperity, and public and private investments. The Climate Action Plan has pending and future legislation in many areas of the county. Montgomery County Public Schools needs to be able to have the flexibility to address these regulations that are adopted by the county, some of which may be addressed by system regulation. Some examples include adopting new integrational green construction codes and other related regulations such as the electrification of lawnmowers, leaf blowers, as well as voluntary compliance with the building efficiency and performance standards. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see some of the work that we've done with other committees and with Montgomery County Public Schools. We've talked with the Fiscal Management Committee about these various topics. We've also been very focused on how this does relate to the Montgomery County Strategic Plan in terms of a safe and healthy learning environment, professional and operational excellence, as well as college and career readiness and career training opportunities for our students. Having students prepared for a career is a very strong element in the Climate Action Plan. There are many budding industries, whether it be solar technologies, electric vehicles, or landscaping and stormwater management, that are sorely in need of trained and qualified staff able to meet the future demand. And of course, as a school system, it's important that we prepare our students for these careers and have the facilities and infrastructure in place for them to be able to engage in them. Next slide, please. The stakeholder engagement in preparation for this policy change has been underway for quite some time. In February of last year, we held the Youth Climate Town Hall, which was part of the Montgomery County Climate Action Plan development. In May of this year, we held a secondary student sustainability symposium during lunchtime to celebrate Earth Day, where we actually engaged with over 100 students about their concerns about culture and the environment. During the summer, we held a professional development session for science resource teachers. And this fall, we have convened a sustainability stakeholder engagement group. What we found in many of these symposiums that we held was that there was high level of student awareness of this, but in general, a lower level of overall knowledge about climate change and the Climate Action Plan. We did overview of the current state and plans when we had our various meetings, as well as used polls, and found that our priorities of the Climate Action Plan were very similar, aligned with the students and the stakeholder engagement groups. Next slide, please. We know that the policy has to address reality in what we've heard from our stakeholders. Some of the students have had a keen interest in taking action and raising the awareness of our current state. Two facets to addressing climate change arose as major themes in all of these meetings. The first was to make sure that we had staff and students educated through both curriculum as well as professional development to identify what they can do as individuals, as well as what we can do as an institution to reduce our greenhouse gases. We are unique in that our mission is education. As I mentioned previously, in the Climate Action Plan, MCPS is tasked with important educational mission and goals. In terms of increasing student and staff knowledge of the climate change, topics that arose were things like changing the curriculum, increasing our number of certified green schools, increasing professional development, including field, outdoor, garden experiences, and cross-disciplinary experiences, actions that individuals can take, as well as staff training on new technologies. One of the critical areas that the groups raised is that staff responsible for maintaining these new technologies will need training to be able to maintain the new systems that they may be unfamiliar with. In the second area of reduction of greenhouse gases, it was very important to the stakeholders that we try to reach the Montgomery County Climate Action Goals and that we take big, bold, fast investments in greenhouse gas reduction. On top of that, resilience, clean energy, equity were very common themes throughout the discussions, as well as transparency of sharing data and engaging and empowering our staff and students to be part of the solution. Next slide, please. So the policy includes energy and natural resource conservation as it did previously, but we also are seeking to reduce environmental impact and cost, improve the health and wellness of our students and staff, and provide effective environmental and sustainability education both in the curriculum and in the instruction for staff. Every person in every school should know how their facility contributes towards a more sustainable process and future, and that this is part of everyone's job. And again, equity remained a theme and a conversation that, again, it shouldn't just be the new schools. We need to make sure that we've got it spread across the system. Next slide, please. In terms of the various positions and strategies that we would like to take in this policy that is proposed, we're looking at reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, reduction of energy use intensity, a reduced reliance on non-renewable resources, increased efficiency in waste reduction, as well as mitigation of the effects of climate change. Public engagement, partnerships, and educations are a critical part of making this all a big success. Next slide, please. In terms of our implementation strategies, it's important that we promote sustainability at all levels, that we develop processes to establish an organizational culture and operational procedures that foster creativity, cross-departmental collaboration, and innovation that implements systematic climate solutions. It's also important that we infuse those concepts across the curriculum and professional development to provide new opportunities for staff, as well as identify both immediate and longer-term actions that we can take to align with the County Climate Action Plan. Next slide, please. Some very specific strategies have been identified in the policy that will be evergreen for us across the next several years. Obviously, using technology to actively manage our energy and utility consumption, continue to procure our utilities to enable cost savings through a wholesale managed approach, enhance and improve our behavior-based sustainability programs, convert and replace our fleet, update the new construction standards, while at the same time improve our existing energy savings through improving our existing infrastructure in a win-win formula so that we can create better facilities for the facilities that aren't going to be constructed imminently. And lastly, increase resiliency, such as mitigating other effects of climate change, reducing impacts to the Chesapeake Bay, improving stormwater control and management, reducing urban heat island effects through tree canopies, and hardening our emergency shelters. It will be a balance that we have to maintain. Instead of spending all of our money in one area, we want to make sure that we use our funds wisely to reduce our total kilowatt load instead of for long-term corrections and reduce our energy use overall. So this final slide shows the next steps that we are going to be continuing to engage with stakeholders. We have both PLCs planned as well as a youth town hall that we're working on scheduling for next month, I believe. And then the rest of the timeline as proposed is up there pending the conversation today. Can I answer any questions?
Great, thank you. So I will open it up to my colleagues, but I first just want to say, thank you for the work that you've done on this, and I know you've worked with Fiscal Management Committee as well on this, but as I think you might have mentioned, this was originally from back in the 70s, so it's been quite a long time coming, and I appreciate the work you've done on it. Do any of you have any comments or questions? Ms. Olini?
Yes, I have a number of comments and questions about this. The first is, reading through the draft policy, I saw a lot about making sure that we're not burdening future generations, being aware of our impact on the future. But the climate crisis is happening right now, right? Our students who are enrolled in our schools right now are going to be around for another 60, 70, 80 years, and they're going to feel the impact of the climate crisis. There are also, we read the news every day. There are wildfires happening. There are droughts happening. The climate crisis is happening right now. So I don't know if it would be possible to change the language in the policy to better reflect that. The fact that this isn't a problem that we're looking towards, 20 years down the future. It is truly a problem that we face here, yes, and also across the world right now, and we're a contributor to that. The second thing I would say, another comment I had about the draft policy is I hear a lot from students that part of the issue we see with the climate change education we receive right now is that there is a huge emphasis on the role that we all play as individuals, right? Don't eat meat, watch your gasoline consumption, turn off the lights when you leave the house. And we don't talk a lot about the role of governments, our school system, industries, corporations. And when I'm looking at Part E of this policy under implementation strategies, we talk about curriculum, but it still kind of seems to really emphasize the role of individuals and not as much institutions. And I did hear you mention in your presentation that the role of institutions is something that we would like to see reflected in our curriculum. So I think it would be great if that could be reflected in this policy as well. Okay. Cool. And then a few other comments I have. One is a question about on page 8 of the draft policy, when it talks about maximizing solar production potential and minimizing energy use intensity, what does considering a balanced portfolio mean?
So that comes back to the question about making sure that we've looked at all of the buildings, right? We don't want to invest a giant amount in a new building and cause that to us not be able to invest money into an existing building. So we want to make sure that we're looking across the system in an equitable way and make sure that every student in every building can see sustainability features in every building.
So when we talk about the portfolio, that's the portfolio of all the various projects we have happening. Facility projects, and not within a singular project.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, just to clarify, the portfolio meaning all of our facilities.
Yes.
All of our infrastructure, yes.
Yes, okay. All right, and then another just comment I have is that there are a lot of really, really good goals that we have outlined for our school system in this policy. Nothing that I can particularly disagree with, that I can see anyone disagreeing with. But I know the County Council in 2017 set that numerical goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. Is there some sort of numerical standard goal that we are holding the school system to in terms of reducing our environmental footprint?
I don't know if we would recommend a numerical goal at this point. I think what's really important from a policy perspective is to really understand where we're at as a school district and where we're at from a portfolio perspective, and really start to change our thinking around how we prioritize projects. One of the things that we've spent some time with Dr. Daka in Fiscal Management Committee is just this notion of, when we have to make tough decisions, we have to make decisions around the work we do. Is sustainability that one of those key items that we focus on? And what we're hoping to do is through this policy is to have that be a key component. So one of the challenges is that we do have, close over 26 million square feet. We have aging facilities, we have aging infrastructure. So I think when we talk about a numerical goal, that's sometimes difficult to just say a numerical goal without really understanding, what it means and what some of the fiscal implications are. I think, again, the challenge with the school system is we are not a funding body. So we are going to have to rely on the county council in terms of setting, obviously doing those measurements, setting those goals, and then identifying the funds required to meet those. So I think a big part of, as we move from establishing a policy and then really get into more of the implementation, is to do that measurement, is to identify numerical lofty goals, and then also identify what the costs associated are with that, and work with our partners to see if it is feasible. That's the last thing we want to do is to set a goal that we don't think is feasible, particularly if the funding is not available from a county council perspective. So we certainly want to make this a priority, but want to make sure all the data and information is on the table as we move through the implementation phase of this.
I'm assuming anything like that would end up being part of like a regulation as opposed to the policy anyways,
Right.
correct? So that's something that would be a more fluid document that we could, be reevaluated every year type of thing.
Yes, that's what I expected. I didn't think it would be appropriate for this policy, but I thought it was relevant to this discussion. And so I wanted to bring it up because I do trust the people on this panel to make environmental conservation a priority in all of the projects that we do. But what about the people who come in after us, right? Long-term sustainability, and oftentimes it is important to have those sort of goals in mind to keep us accountable. But I appreciate that response. And the last thing I would say really quickly is just before this comes to the full board, this presentation, I would appreciate a little bit more detail on the stakeholder engagement component of creating this policy. Just a little bit more detail about who was engaged, the numbers, and not just an overview of the various events that took place. That would be appreciated. Thank you.
I have one follow-up question, and then I'll see if you guys have anything. But to one of the questions you were asking about the balanced portfolio, I appreciate you're saying it's about, all of our facilities. Is it also, I assumed it also had to do with alternative options for sustainability. So, for example, the solar panels, I bring this up pretty much with every school design, versus solar panels versus a green roof and things like that. But I don't necessarily understand the process for determining which it is that you would use and why you would ever pick anything over solar energy and production.
And I think it is certainly when we talk about a balanced portfolio, it's our focus on our funding efforts. And I think too, when you think about some of the sustainability goals, water conservation, you think about tree canopy, obviously energy production, energy reduction. I think a part of it is really understanding what the costs are and making sure we have a really holistic, well-rounded approach to the entire portfolio of our buildings and our system, but also even individual projects. So, for example, we would not want to spend a majority of our money on one area if there's an opportunity to have a very well-rounded approach and to move the needle on many of the sustainability priorities that we identify within a policy. So, I think in terms of again the balance perspective, it's more than just solar. It's more than just the way to generate energy. It's really making sure that we understand what all those priorities are, and we are accountable to impacting each and every one of them. So I think there's a few pieces to that in terms of that's individual project specific, but then even broader to our entire school district and school building portfolio as well.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Jacka?
Ms. Mondrowski came up with a good question about when do we use the solar energy, when do we use the gardens on top, when do we do certain kinds of lighting and the geothermal. And I think that when these renovations are done or new buildings are done, it's good to emphasize why certain things have been done. And I just want to reiterate that I've said this before, but when we get the description of new buildings or renovations or additions, all that information is in there about what you've done in terms of energy conservation and sustainability, but we kind of pass over it quickly. Mm-hmm. So I just am going to keep going to that and mentioning that because I think it's really important because people just don't know what kinds of things that we do to abide by what the county wants and just knowing that we need to do some of these things because it's a good thing to do.
And that is a great point, Dr. Docton. We have heard you loud and clear, and I think as we move through this policy, to hold ourselves accountable and identify on each and every project how we're impacting the work within the sustainability area and focus on individual areas. Again, sort of back to that balance piece, we have projects that are in special protection areas. So, to highlight that, to talk about the features that we've included and their environmental impact, I think is really important and powerful to move the needle, both from a project perspective, but from a cultural, from an understanding from an education perspective as well. So, yes, we absolutely will come back and have much more focus and emphasis on that in future presentations.
And I was just gonna, so nothing to add, but just say great work to our legal department on the policy and just to you all. And I'm glad that this policy has been updated because we have been doing some work over the years. And although it has not been amended since 2002, I believe, right, that there are a lot of things that we've done to keep up. And Seth, what's that book that you have? Because that has great information, that booklet that you have. Don't we have a booklet, the environmental sustainability booklet that we produce? I don't know that people really take a look at that book very often as well. And it puts all of our work in there on what we do. So just thank you to all of you. Yep.
So, my only other question where it really was, so on page 8, under H, line 207, implement other measures to address resiliency, such as increasing the tree canopy on MCPS properties and mitigating storm water runoff. Obviously there are a list of other things that, we can do, we should be doing. I'd love to see things like green walls in some of our schools and stuff like that when possible. And even things with construction, there are a lot of very innovative things available now. Is there somewhere that you'll go to be further in detail of that? Will that fall into the book, for example, that Ms. Evans is referencing in terms of things that we do for sustainability, or?
Yeah, so I think that's one of our goals too, from a variety of the outreach and communication education is to start highlighting these elements. And I think an important part of it is to identify what work is happening on individual projects and how it moves the needle on our sustainability policy. I think that's one of the areas that's been missing, is that our previous policy focused just on energy. But we didn't really have much emphasis or discussion around, are there some costs associated with some of the work around stormwater management or heat island effect reductions that I think are really powerful related to this policy that we'll certainly be able to identify and again hold ourselves accountable to show the measurements along the way of how we're moving that needle. So we do plan to, through implementation, possibly through regulation, to really think about how this is displayed on a website, how it's displayed in a school, and really show folks that something as simple as a rain garden, how does that contribute to the bay environment or our watershed environment. So that is absolutely a big part of our goals from a sustainability perspective, is to display and show how these measures impact from a day-to-day perspective as well.
What about things like composting and, gardens in our, when we're doing new construction, do we consider putting areas for those type of things in our projects?
And I think too, one of the important parts of this is that, there's a lot of emerging technologies and ideas and concepts within the sustainability area. Some of them are extremely costly and don't necessarily have the environmental impacts that some other approaches may have. So during our construction projects and during any of the renovation and our future work, we really want to highlight that. I know we're working through some pilots around composting. There are costs associated with that, but be able to identify what environmental impacts are happening with this and what are the costs associated with that, then allows us, both you as a board and us as staff, to make decisions on, again, how to move the needle much further in the future. One of the things that Lynn's highlighted is from a building energy, from a transportation standpoint, currently they are the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases. So, if we had a decision between composting versus, reducing energy in our buildings, obviously we'd want to focus on the energy reduction in our building to move the needle on a greenhouse gas effect. So I think, again, a big part of this is to identify, what those environmental impacts are, what are the costs that are associated with it, and then be able to make decisions. But yes, we explore all opportunities and want to make the best decisions we can from a cost perspective, moving forward, that is going to move the needle on our energy reduction and greenhouse gas reductions.
Okay, great. So just a point of clarification. So this is the first draft of this. I'm not sure if I'm asking them or asking you, but, and Ms. Oluni has made some suggestions in terms of verbiage. I'm not sure if this being the first draft, you'll go back, do those, and it comes back to policy, or if we can just move it for discussion to the full board. I'm not.
We may want to make a decision being mindful of the deadlines stated in state law that we have to have a policy on the books by July 1. So
I'm going to suggest
you might
perhaps you make
want us to try to make those
Yes.
additions, and then,
Yeah.
you might want to consider doing that at
just
tentative
moving it to the
action
full
to
board.
keep it rolling.
Okay. Are you all comfortable with that? Ms. Oluni had something?
Yeah, I just had one more comment on the policy itself, Mr. Adams. I appreciated your comment about energy conservation being where our focus should be, because I think that's where we can make the biggest dent, make the biggest impact environmentally. I do think that the policy, especially under implementation strategies, does focus a lot still on energy conservation as opposed to other environmental strategies. I guess comes from the root of this policy to begin with. But I don't see a lot about purchasing of materials and shifting towards or shifting towards reusable materials. I'm thinking about our lunch, as well as monitoring our waste. I see a lot about energy consumption and water consumption, but not about the amount of trash and waste that we produce as a system, which I imagine is considerable.
I would say in the position, in section, paragraph 5, we talked about looking at waste reduction and greenhouse gas emissions in decisions related to purchasing, including but not limited to energy, transportation, and other operational areas. And so the waste reduction, and that was the intent to include that in there. We didn't have specific strategies, except for that last paragraph that you'd referenced where it said implement other strategies. Paragraph H. So I'm talking about page 4, number 5, in terms of waste reduction. But if I guess, are you asking to add another, like a paragraph I, to talk a little to that?
Yeah, that would be great. Purchasing of materials.
This is something to
And I would say too, I think there's a lot that can be gained from some of our building techniques and strategies. We certainly, when we achieve, green building standards, there's quite a bit about how much is recycled within our waste stream. There's quite a bit in there about how much to procure and source from locally, within a 150-mile radius, the materials. So I think we have been doing that for a good decade now, but I think, to incorporate some of that into other practices and in this policy would be a great addition. So we can certainly build off from some of those pre-existing standards that exist.
I would appreciate if you would add that in as well. I think that's an excellent point. Kind of going back to my point about there are a lot of new things out there. I toured this company, Dirt. I don't know if you've had a chance to go over and see what the stuff that they do, but it's really interesting, the work what people are doing to try and help in this area. So that would be great. And the only other question that I had, but I'm not sure it's relevant, was just about whether or not the planning board gives any feedback on this kind of policy. I'm assuming they do not generally, but I didn't know if that's something that we wanted to, just in terms of Montgomery County looking as a whole, across agency, to multiple agencies in those things that we do or recommendations that they might have or suggestions, but.
I think not necessarily just focusing on the planning board, but I know
Right.
Lynn has been working quite a bit with Department of Energy Protection,
Okay.
certainly other county agencies, but we can certainly extend an offer to the planning board to take a peek and provide any comments as well.
That'd be great.
Right,
Thank
as
you.
part of the County Climate Action Plan, there's a bi-monthly meeting where the climate leaders from all the different government agencies sit down and talk about a variety of different issues. So we talk about energy efficiency, we talk about vehicles, we talk about electric vehicles. There's lots of different meetings where all the agencies are coming together, and this is one of the greatest things about the Climate Action Plan and sustainability is that now everybody's rallied behind this cause towards making sure that we do have a sustainable future. It's no longer positional. It's really everybody working together towards these common goals. It's
That's
been
great.
very invigorating.
I love that. Ms. Evans, did you have
I was just going to say, is that what don't we kind of make note of that, so to speak, on page 7 under 2B? Use a wholesale managed approach for utility procurement, participate in coordinated efforts with federal, state, and local government agencies to establish appropriate resource conservation plans. I think
Yeah,
Or you
well, I
wanted-
mean, it's
you
a
wanted it
little
laid out?
different,
You
but
wanted it,
yeah, I was
like,
gonna say that,
okay.
I think that's more in reference to buying bulk energy and fuel and things like that, correct? Or no? At least that's what I assumed that had meant. Okay. Okay, well, yep, and then I guess in the spirit of moving this to make sure we reach our deadlines, if you all are comfortable with it, we can have them make the adjustments that were discussed, bring it back to the full board, and we can talk about it further at the full board. Does that work for you, Ms. O'Leary?
Yes, it does. One lingering comment. I'm sorry. This is something students are particularly passionate about. Is there any way, and I'm thinking about our last board meeting where we talked about menstrual product dispensers and committing to using 100% cotton products because that's the most sustainable option available to us. Is there any way we can hold ourselves to or include something about purchasing the most sustainable products possible wherever possible? Lawyers can clean up that language a little bit, but
I don't know if you want to comment on that now, or if you just want to
I
just,
think we would have to go look for places,
Right,
but
see what-
certainly we will look for places to integrate that idea.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much then. I appreciate all your work on this so far. Good first draft. I very much appreciate it. And then I guess we can go ahead and move on to item number 4, which is policy ABA, the community involvement piece. And so while you all are shifting or whatever, I'll just give a little bit of an overview that, the policy review was prompted by a request from Pat O'Neill and Ms. O'Looney to examine public participation opportunities for students, parents, and guardians, and community members so that their ideas, interests, and concerns are considered and valued in board and MCPS decision-making processes. A framework for review of this policy was presented at the October 21st Policy Committee meeting. And today we will review proposed revisions to the policy and add our thoughts on that. So with that, I will turn it over to legal and the Office of Strategic Initiatives and let you all go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Mrs. Mondrowski. Last revised in 2013, Policy ABA is under revision to bring it into line with emerging practices in community engagement. Proposed changes to ABA are intended to serve as an umbrella for all policies and regulations, describe community engagement for board decision-making. Colleagues from the Office of Strategic Initiatives who have been driving this revision are here to present. I'll ask Mr. Landesman and his team to introduce themselves as they begin their comments.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Mondraski, Dr. Daka, Mrs. Evans, and Ms. Oluni. My name is John Landsman. I'm the Executive Director in the Office of Strategic Initiatives, and I'm here with my colleagues, Francis Frost from the Office of Student and Family Support and Engagement, and Dina Cunet and Edvin Hernandez from the Equity Initiatives Unit. The rest of our policy team includes Danielle Wilson-Sadler and Terry Musey from Student and Family Support and Engagement, and Maria Hay from the Equity Initiatives Unit. We're excited to share our reimagined policy for community involvement, which we are suggesting to change to community engagement. To be honest, the past few weeks of working on this policy was an emotional journey for our team. As we worked through the language, listened to the feedback from focus groups, and wrestled with the conventions of how policies are written, our own experiences of feeling unheard and unseen as MCPS employees, parents, and former students continued to come up. I made a point of introducing our entire team just a moment ago. Each of us has a very different experience that is influenced by our ages, gender identity, sexual orientation, and our cultural and racial backgrounds. This policy could not have been written without the experience and voice of each individual member. And that's the point of the policy we are about to review with you. A large and diverse system like MCPS cannot effectively make decisions, write policy, and develop practices without the input and collaboration of all its diverse stakeholders. As you listen to our presentation and read the draft, you will recognize that this is not merely a modification of the current version. Our belief is that the original policy contributes to a lack of engagement. The fact is that we already have the tools and professional development in MCPS for effective community engagement, and there are many staff members who demonstrate this every day. This kind of engagement, however, will not be normalized until we have an intentional, easy-to-understand policy that holds us accountable for effective and culturally responsive engagement. Next slide, please. With all of that in mind, the purpose of this policy is to affirm the board's strongly held belief that equitable outcomes, success, and well-being for all students require the engagement of the whole community. To establish research-based guidelines for levels of community engagement in board decision-making processes that strengthens relationships between students, staff, schools, and the broader community. Acknowledging that engaging stakeholders requires intentional and culturally responsive engagement practices and structures, and to ensure culturally responsive engagement guidelines, structures, and practices. Next slide, please. Culturally responsive engagement is not rocket science, but it does require an appreciation for the complexity of effective engagement practices. It also requires an understanding that there are research-based models of engagement that we can build on. This revised policy also acknowledges that unless there are clear guidelines and structures that consider the complexity and culture responsive engagement practices, we will not hear from stakeholders that are most adversely affected by board and district policies. Next slide, and I'd like to turn it to Dina Cunet.
Good afternoon. In developing this revision, we wanted to ensure that we used quantitative and qualitative data. So we leaned into a research method developed by the International Association of Public Participation. And they recommend that there are 4 elements for democratic decision-making with the public. Those elements are to inform, consult, involve, and collaborate. The definitions are in the written policy. But here we'd like to elevate the term involve as a way to put on the table our request to change the name of the policy. It's currently community involvement, and our recommendation is to change it to community engagement. And the reason for this is that involvement, by definition, means to envelop or enfold into something that's already existing. And we know in our experience that our current policies of engaging the community are not working for all of our community members. Therefore, we would like to go with engagement, which implies that we are kind of coming together, working together, and hearing from our community in ways that we create with them. So also here on this slide, you'll see how we define our stakeholders. The list is pretty expansive there, but I think the one bullet that really stands out is the fourth one, and it's that who are our stakeholders? They are anyone who advocates on behalf of the social, emotional, and academic well-being of all students and community members. So what do we hope to gain in revising this policy using these community engagement elements with our stakeholders? We do have a desired goal that is written, but before we go into that, John talked about the struggle and the reflections and the experiences as a team that we went through in thinking about this policy. And that really took me back to myself growing up. I grew up in a lovely, nurturing community in Prince George's County. It was all Black community. All of my leaders and teachers were Black. And it was by design, have you. We were kind of segregated intentionally in that community, but it was lovely and nurturing nevertheless. So actually my elementary school was in the center of our community. So there were really no hard lines between community and school. It wasn't uncommon to see teachers coming through the neighborhood, as we also had parents walking up the hill to the school. So our teachers knew the hopes and dreams that our parents held for us and the expectations. And our parents knew the expectations of our teachers. So the twain did meet. And if we as students did not align with that, there were consequences and repercussions to pay. So my point in telling this story is that we had a culture of communication and respect and collaboration within the community. And so when decisions needed to be made or policies discussed, and then the district needed feedback, it wasn't a big to-do to figure out how to do that, because it already existed. It was a proactive, we had proactively created this community. And so with this policy revision, that is our desired outcome, that we are making connections with our communities on an ongoing basis, so therefore we don't have to be puzzled by how we engage all of our community members in the future. And we also want to position ourselves as a district as listeners and not just as leaders in creating two-way communication, so that our system will benefit from the contributions and the diversity and the skills and the knowledge and the experiences of all of our community members as we create an equitable education system that provides success and well-being for all of our students. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my work family colleague, Edwin Hernandez, so that he can speak to how we collected our qualitative data to inform how we revised the policy.
Thank you, Dina. Next slide, please. Last time that I was, one more.
To that one.
One more, please. Next slide. Thank you. Last time I spoke before you, I mentioned how this body of work made me feel that all my emotions were going to jump out of my body. They did. And I wanted to report that when we started doing this work, we identified some questions to put in a survey and to send to different diverse groups in the community. Students, families, staff, action groups. And what we discovered is that we also needed to recognize that different community groups have different cultures. And so we needed to be intentional in having focus groups, because not everyone would be able to complete a survey. It was needed that we had that approach of face-to-face via Zoom with some community groups. And so we had several focus groups in various languages in English, Spanish, Chinese, Amharic, and Vietnamese. And what I'm going to share with you is what we heard from those focus groups. So what the participants identify is that there's this lack of sense of belonging in MCPS, and parents don't feel or don't see themselves represented in the system, especially when policies are written only in English. They identified a need to have policies available, accessible in various languages. If we're going to garner their input, the communication must not make them feel marginalized. And so this contributes to that feeling of not being heard, valued, or seen in the system. And also, the need for the language in the policy needs to be more specific. They feel that it is too vague and that there's no specific action in the policy. So if we want community engagement, communication needs to be far more reaching and multilingual to all communities. Stakeholders also feel that as a system, the communication needs to be bilateral. And not only when we want information from them, but that the communication must be ongoing all the time. They identify that. There also needs to be engagement that is intentional, culturally proficient, apply an equity lens to our approach, have specific goals for participation, and use metrics to measure our efforts for engagement. That was also pointed out by the participants. We had several high school students that participated in the focus group, and they expressed a desire to be part of the decision-making process in creating policies as well. Finally, when we think about building the capacity of stakeholders so that they can participate or be engaged, they also identify that we as a system also need to build our capacity in engaging the community. And I'll pass it on to Francis.
Thank you, Edvin. So you have heard the rationale, the process, and the stakeholder views that have been incorporated into the revision of policy ABA, including its name change to community engagement. And you have the draft policy before you. Without reading it word for word, we'd like to highlight the key concepts which are represented in this draft. Next slide, please. So first is to apply an equity lens to the work of community engagement in alignment with board policy ACA, non-discrimination, equity, and cultural proficiency. In the draft, you will see, beginning on page 8, the considerations for who is participating, the inclusion of students, the appropriate outreach, an appropriate process, and an evaluation of our effectiveness in our engagement. Additionally, this draft includes guiding questions as laid out in the district's evidence of equity as a measure of evaluation, requiring us in our process to ask who is participating and how and who may be negatively impacted in our resulting decisions. As noted in the draft, a substantial portion of the board decisions impacts our students. Discussed by our student member of the board, and as we heard from students in our focus group, students want to be engaged in their education. In this draft, students are intentionally included as a participating stakeholder in community engagement efforts whenever appropriate and feasible, using appropriate methods of engagement. We want to use the best practice tools for culturally inclusive and appropriate engagement, which we already have in our toolbox, including the MCPS Culturally Responsive Engagement Planning and Implementation Tool and Evidence of Equity. In our diverse community, there is no one approach that works for all of our stakeholders. This draft encourages the use of a variety of methods of community engagement depending on the goal of such interactions, as was mentioned by Dina and Edvin in their examples. We also want effective community engagement that requires effective staff who are knowledgeable and prepared to conduct such activities, and the appropriate professional development and resources is important for that goal. To ensure accountability, this draft calls for a report back to the board on community engagement efforts, which reflects an accounting of the provisions which are laid out in the policy. You will also see in this draft support to our local school administrators so that effective community engagement is replicated and implemented in our local communities. Because community engagement is not only about board level and district decisions, but the relationships that make those that make the district level engagement possible begins in our neighborhoods, in the schools that are closest to our stakeholders. To ensure that this policy is more than words on a paper, this draft also requires a cross-office committee responsible for continual improvement based on research and best practices in the field and professional development on culturally responsive community engagement. We believe that this draft is robust and incorporates what we have heard from our community members during this process, as well as in previous work of members of the team and from board members. We feel that the draft policy we have presented to you will move this district forward towards a more inclusive, actively engaged community that is reflective of our students and residents. We thank you for the opportunity to prepare this draft for your consideration, and we welcome your questions.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and start with my colleagues. Ms. Evans?
Yes, no, thank you so much for the presentation. This was great. I love how you started off, Mr. Landsman, and I loved hearing from, I don't want to pronounce your name wrong, Miss I was going to be professional in public, but Gina, oh my goodness, just how you laid out how it was for you growing up. Very similar experience, and I just loved how you all shared how the work was and how it touched you. And I'm glad we were able to go out and talk to our community to get their input. And I earmarked the pages that really resonated with me, but you got it out in the PowerPoint, the key concepts that were addressed, but just how you addressed putting in the questions that were through an equity lens. That's so important. And to have it laid out in our policy is good for everyone to see. Definitely one of our core values, as you all know. But this gets to the heart of it in this policy, and it's so easy to see. And then very much love what was in number, I believe it's number on page, the piece about staff is on page 11, where number 7B, where the superintendent will have a designee responsible for technical assistance to our schools. That's so important, right? And we hear that from our schools too, oftentimes, to be able to have a guide. But I think it's important that as we make certain that we're engaging in the right way, that we do give our schools the tools, right? So just thank you all for the work that you've done in a short period of time. Really appreciate that, and looking forward to continuing to get that feedback from you all.
Dr. Daka?
I think Hannah had her light on.
Sorry, I didn't know she wanted to go ahead.
Yes. Before I get into my comments, I also just wanted to thank you all, not just for doing this work, but for how you did it. I think is so important. You really took exactly what we're trying to do with this policy and you embodied it. And so I really appreciate you being vulnerable and bringing your identity and your whole self into crafting this. So to get into my comments, I really do appreciate in Section D, the position section of this policy, specifically calling out students and specifically calling out why we should be engaging them. I would appreciate if that was added into a subsection in Section B, issue as well. Students are who we serve in this school system, and I think because of that very unique relationship that is different from any of our other stakeholders, I think that needs to be specifically called out in Section B, the issue section, because I think that is where the district can get oftentimes the most valuable feedback, and that's how we improve our processes, and that's how we grow as a school system. So I would appreciate that addition. And then accountability. I really love the measures of accountability that are embedded into this policy. I think that is so important. In Section D, is it 6? Yes, 6. The questions that are added here I think are really important. One question that I really see is missing. There are great ones about Oh, sorry, excuse me. This is about the report that needs to be shared with the board before any decisions are made. One question that I see is missing is who was engaged? Right, so there's a summary of activities, participation goals, but who was engaged, some numerical data I think would be great to include in there as well. And then on page 9, when the various methods are spelled out, we have focus groups, task forces, work groups, technologically facilitated communication. Can we define each of those terms? Is that possible? Yes, okay.
Yes, we can do that.
Great. There's just a lot of terms there, and I honestly don't even know how to differentiate a focus group from a task force. So I think it would be really great to define each of those terms. And then finally, Mr. Hernandez, I really appreciated your comment about bilateral communication, and I think the change in the name of the policy really reflects that, from community involvement in our decisions to bilateral community engagement. I don't really see that reflected in the policy, though. I think this policy focuses a lot more on how MCPS can include different stakeholders in our decisions. Is there anything in here that talks about the other side of how the community can get MCPS and the board to pay attention to specific issues?
Excellent question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe we did not include that specifically, but we can pull from the presentation to add language that specifically speaks to how we can do that in the reverse.
Yes, I think that would be great, just to reflect the change in the name, and then also what clearly a lot of our stakeholders thought was missing from this policy. It would be great to include that. But that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Dr. Daka?
Thank you. I just wanted to say how far we have come in MCPS in terms of reaching out to the community. When I first came, we were talking about the construction, and we were only dealing with PTA with questions, and we kept saying, you need to go to the homeowners associations. Other people then are in PTA need to make some comments or some input into this. And I also want to say that we are now knocking on doors, and I know that's really important because sometimes people don't belong to either organization, but we still need to hear from them. And I know that was done in Twin Brook. That's the latest example that I can give. And I know that we were helped by somebody that used to work for the council as well. So it wasn't just MCPS that was doing this. And we also are making efforts to meet where the community gathers, and it might be a party space where they live, or a rec center that they go to, or it could be Westfield Mall. But in order to get people where they are, to let them know what is happening, I think we're doing a better job on that. And there is an issue that came up when we were having a conversation with one of the high schools had a conversation about reaching out, and one of the persons that was in charge of it said that marginal groups of people who are not reached very often, just those people, should be reached, but they should also take a lead in the conversation. And lots of times they don't get that chance. Somebody talks to them and says, this is what you ought to do. And on line 100, collaborate, I knew I had read it somewhere. Collaborate just doesn't mean, well, we're going to work together. It does mean that here's the problem. What do you think we should do with it? Here's what we think. And I think that's the direction that we're going to be going with in the policy. And so thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Dr. Daka. Interestingly enough, she just touched on one of my things, was on page 9, section 4. I was wondering if we could put something in line with participation techniques may include any methods. I was suggesting that we add something along the lines of reaching people where they are, in efforts to reach people where they are. And I had written down including door knocking, because that is something that I suspect we're going to need to be doing more and more of if we really want to hear from the people who are most dramatically and directly affected by some of the decisions that we make. Because it is hard to get a hold of everybody. And I do also think that one of the things I had in my note is that, I think we need to be clear with communication and what people's roles are on these committees that we have. And I don't know if that's specifically addressed here, but, and just the fact that, to Dr. Daka's point, we have come so far in all of this, but being very intentional about making sure that we are getting a variety of not just stakeholders, but I don't know the right way to say this because it is a variety of stakeholders, but in other words, we want students, for example, we don't want the same students all the time, and we want to make sure that we're getting a variety of kids' voices from the top courses to the ones who are ineligible to participate in sports or have a threat of not graduating on time, things like that. And so just making sure that that is really intentionally identified in here, I think would be very important, if you want to speak to that.
Thank you for that. And in terms of the intentionality of what we're asking people in their involvement, we tried to cover that on page 4 in the community engagement goal, because we agree that that often gets very confusing, and then that leads to frustration, I think, with both staff and community members and families. And so we've tried to put in some definitions and when people create a plan, our goal is to have them write what the goal is using these definitions.
Okay, so that would be a mapped out plan or goal and plan for each.
Exactly. So for us, we start with what's the goal? Like, why do we want to get people involved? Mm-hmm. And then when you map out the engagement strategy to meet that goal. And so all of that should be mapped out. Because depending on the goal, how you engage folks, how you recruit, how you run those meetings, all of those will be different. And so all that would be mapped out in the plan that we're asking people to create.
Right. Okay. I also know that sometimes MCPS is accused of putting together work groups or committees, getting community feedback, but because if it doesn't end up turning out in the direction that they are thinking it's going to, or something else, making sure that people understand what their role is in terms of this. It still has to go back to the full board. There are still other considerations, and this is one, because you don't want people thinking that they've wasted time by participating. And similarly to Ms. Oluni, I just want to say thank you so much for the discussion about the bilateral communication, because I think it's critical. I also want to make sure that, and I'm pleased that with our steps towards hiring an ombudsman and things like that, to ensure that people not only know how to reach us, but are comfortable with reaching us all of the time and sharing their thoughts. And, I think we're lucky that we have a very vocal community in general, but I do always worry about hearing from the same stakeholders all of the time. And also I want to thank you all for using research-based models in this. I think that that's really critical, especially, so we're not totally reinventing the wheel. So did anybody have any other thoughts or questions about this that they?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to throw South Lake out there. The kind of work that was done in South Lake with parents, and they're very involved, and they fill up the all-purpose room. They come here on buses, and they're really a part of it. So I have to congratulate the staff and the community and the administrator for that kind of thing. But that's the kind of thing we would like to see happening at at schools.
Yes, that actually reminds me in that list of, and I know that that list was, you know, what's the word I'm looking, and up to, but not only about, but I do think that, you know, one thing that we hear from families all the time is that the most effective communications that they get comes directly from their schools. So just, you know, I don't know if it should be part of this policy specifically, but the importance of utilizing school communities to reach our families, I think is important. So if there is nothing else, what would be the next steps for this? I feel like this is a really important policy. I don't know if you all would agree that that I think it could be worth bringing back after you've looked at it a little bit more. And then taking it to the full board, but if there's a time crunch, then please feel free to speak up.
There is not a deadline on this project, and if you would like us to come back to policy management, we
You all comfortable with that? Ms. Evans? Well, just in talking, just with the suggestions that, you know, we've raised here, I'm fine if we just want to move it to the full board.
I think especially if we want to add the second part, we talked about not just being community involvement, but engagement. That means how can the public reach MCPS? How can they reach their school? That's going to require a lot of additions. So I think it should come back to this committee once before the full board.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
just so you're mindful of this, that makes it a little challenging to finish it this year, just with the deadlines that we have to work with. So
You mean this school year or this to January?
we can come back to you. Our next scheduled policy management committee is February.
Okay.
It would be very challenging to go from a February
Okay.
policy management committee to tentative action, out for public comment, and get it back to you by April, just mindful of the extent of time that it should be out for public comment. That would really concatenate how much of a public comment period you gave the policy while it was out, unless you wanted to let it be out for the spring and pick it back up in the fall.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I was going to say is actually what I was thinking anyways, because I do want to make sure that we give I want to make sure we give ample time for public comment, or even regardless of whether or not, and then after public comment, I feel like it's going to have to come back anyways, so that we can discuss what, you know, public feedback is and have that discussion. So I'd rather do it right than do it fast, if you all are checking with our office as well. Okay. Okay, so let's do that then.
Thank you. We'll certainly bring it back to this committee.
Great. Alrighty, so that would then bring us up to item number 5, policy FFA, naming school facilities. We are reviewing proposed revisions to policy FFA in order to clarify and strengthen the process and criteria that we use to evaluate school names. Mrs. O'Neill was especially interested in revisiting this issue, and requested that staff take another look at the policy and come back to us with some recommendations. The committee initially reviewed the framework for revising this policy during its May 21st, 2021 meeting. That's a little background on how we got here. And with that, I will turn it over to all of you. I was going to say, Mr. Davis, if you want to
Thank you.
join us.
Androwski. I was calling him to join us at the table.
Absolutely. Love to have him.
Staff from the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Schools presented a framework for revision of policy FFA on May 27, 2021. The board directed the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Schools to review policy FFA and recommend revisions to the naming process. Student and family support and engagement staff are here today to present draft language.
Good afternoon again. As you'll see, the policy FFA naming school facilities revisions really went hand in hand in the policy that we just discussed, the community involvement. And I think it worked really well for us to be looking at both of these. We used some of the same community engagement strategies in looking at this policy as well as the first one. So we'll go with the first slide, please. You'll see that the purpose of this policy is to establish the board's responsibility for naming schools and facilities and to set forth criteria by which names are evaluated. Next slide. So as we discussed the idea of naming schools and the process of naming a school or facility, we discussed how much of a commitment it is of your public resources to name a school after a person or after an ideal, and that it's a very high honor for people to have a school named after them. So, and this honor is reserved for ideals, core values, and commitments that are expressed in the board policies, such as policy ACA, non-discrimination, equity, and cultural proficiency. And you'll see that the issues that we brought into this policy are reflected. The names should equitably represent the diversity of Montgomery County. Next slide. So the position that is set forth in this policy provides the board the responsibility for adopting names for schools and facilities. That is the superintendent's responsibility to name a portion of a school or a facility. And then naming that generates financial gain is prohibited unless approved expressly by the Board of Education. So then we also talked about the criteria for acceptable names. So one could be an ideal or concept or curricular objective. So we had examples of like Harmony High School or Science Academy or something like that. Geographic names of Montgomery County. We also added that those names or features should also follow the same provisions as for the names of the persons, the names that they're named after. And then we talked about the names of persons. The persons who a school or facility is named after should be deceased. They should have made a demonstrated contribution to the community, to the county, the state, or the nation, and exemplifies the core values of the board. There should be strong consideration for persons who represent the diversity of the county or who prompted advancement of equity. We've also added language to identify unacceptable names, and you'll see those listed in the policy as well. In summary, those names are ones that denigrate people, are disrespectful language, relates to criminal behavior, refers to business or commercial enterprise, or are fictional. And that maintains the dignity of our names. Next slide, please. In preparing this draft, we did also engage stakeholders in small focus groups to discuss the policy priorities. So the positions and the criteria that you just heard about were discussed with those focus groups and were informed by their feedback. So we had meetings with stakeholders in small groups. We talked about the policies. We had a survey as well as the focus groups. And then we discussed with them the criteria for names, the criteria for renaming, and the responsibility of naming. In addition to students and parents of Montgomery County, we also included discussion with a representative from the Montgomery County Historical Society. We had conversations with a committee from Montgomery County that was established to rename streets in the county, and we also referenced the Montgomery County Parks naming criteria. So we looked at those as benchmarks. When we discussed with our focus group the priorities, most of them agreed that the existing name criteria and the board and superintendent responsibilities should remain as is. They agreed that the school and facility names should reflect the diversity of the county, that the history of the persons which schools are named should be considered. We should also look at the contribution that they have made to the society and the school community, and their contributions toward or disregard for equitable society should also be considered when we're selecting whether a person should be on your approved list. And they felt strongly that the school community should have input into the school naming selection for their particular school. So now I'll turn it over to Ms. Sally to discuss the implementation.
Good afternoon again. So next slide, please. All right, so I am going to take you to page 4 of the policy, just so that we can walk through this. So beginning at page 4, we lay out implementation strategies. The practice has historically been that the board maintained a list. We just augmented that language to provide that the board may periodically provide a review of that list to make sure that names are in alignment with criteria. The naming school facilities process, what's different here is the reference to ABA, as we said, as Francis said so well. In designing ABA, we're trying to create an umbrella function that we point back to when we name processes for board decisions that require community engagement. So we have said there that it will be aligned with ABA, and it will be a primary focus on the students, parents, guardians of that affected school community. And as we discussed in the previous discussion about the purpose of the engagement, it is important to communicate to school communities in the process of naming that the decision will reside with board members, but that the role of community is being consulted on creating a prioritized list. So we did leave in place the language that was existing about the board providing for, the community providing to more. That's certainly up for discussion, but I did want to cycle back to the list that is maintained and researched, because doing that kind of research without enough time to do good historical research, that is a consideration. So the other, moving to page 6, again, we have a process where it will be communicated back to the board, a summary of the activities that occur, an analysis that the name meets the criteria, how the schools, how the name affects the educational mission, and a summary of the engagement activities conducted. So we did want to lay out some language about renaming and to try to lay out a process. You had an existing process whereby petitions would be received and considered. We wanted to flesh out what happened then a little bit more. So the process that we're putting forward for your consideration would look at the petition. Does it meet the criteria? Does the board feel like it's sufficient meeting the criteria? At that point, the task of returning it to the school community would not jump to the step of selecting a name, but it would be the step of deciding what is the community's investment in that name. Do they have an investment at all? What does that name mean to this school community, so that you as a board have some very full information on what this existing name means when you then can deliberate further. Let's move to page 8, which gives you the opportunity to seek independent historical analysis should you need it to reevaluate the name. And then you received a memo in 2019 after a review of all the school names, and this language is drawn from that analysis, which was very comprehensive, for what you may want to consider in deciding that a name should be replaced with a new name. And then it is at that point where you are making a decision that there will be a name change, and then the purpose of returning to the community is a very clear process, much like with a new school. your job as a community, you are being asked to make a prioritized list of recommendations. So we're trying to keep that process consistent, that when it comes back for renaming, it's a similar process to selecting original names. And then another situation that might arise is if you are taking a building out of surplus and you are recommissioning it as a school, and you may want to change the name to reflect the purpose of the new curriculum design. And then, let's see. Oh, I skipped forward. See, we can advance the slide. And advance one more. Okay, so next steps. Again, subject to your discussion, our next steps from here would be to move this for tentative action on January 13th, and then move it forward to completion at the end of this year by May 26th, if all those steps can move as proposed.
Okay, thank you. I have one quick question before I turn it over to my colleagues. And I appreciate your work on this as well. There are timelines associated with the flow of these processes identified specifically, and I didn't necessarily feel like when I was reading through this that I got the, and I was trying to look back to see where I was, but that I felt that I fully understood that it was for the renaming, that it would be that it's a two-step process, that and needs to, I want to make sure that we're very clear with people so that they don't think that them emailing us a bunch of signatures or things like that will automatically make a change be had. Does that make sense? So I don't know if that's something that you feel is clearly stated that I'm missing, or if that's just something that I think should be added in there.
So we would, if you're suggesting revisions, I think you're looking at the bottom of page 6 and page 7. So we stuck with the wording on petitions. We could certainly change that to some other form of communication, but the idea is that someone is presenting you with an idea that meets the criteria, and you are able to evaluate that before making a decision to engage a community by telling them there's been a petition, we'd like to know your interest, your level of engagement with the current name.
Okay. Yeah, I think, well, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, but the only other thing that I really wanted to specify was on page 4, line 115, the board may periodically conduct a review of such names for alignment with naming criteria and relevant board policies, and I feel that that language needs to be changed. I don't think that it should read the board may periodically I think it needs to read the board will or must or should periodically review, and it would be, I think, in terms of policy, that should be clarified. In other words, whether it's a once a year or once every other year. Times are always changing, and what seems like a good idea today may not in 5 years from now or whatever. And so just making sure that we are consistently and continually reviewing the list of names and the accomplishments of the people, and where that fits into our core values as a school system and community would be great.
So would you like something like will continually?
Yes, something like that, yes. And ideally, and this is something that we can, I'm sort of putting out there as a question more than but should it be, every 2 years we will review, or should there be some sort of specified, because sometimes we say we're going to continually, and that can mean once every 5 years, every 10 years. We are technically still continually reviewing it. So I didn't know if my colleagues agree, but that was just something that really struck me as This is something we should be doing regularly after we're all, even after this isn't the same board years from now and whatever. So, Ms. Evans, yes?
Yeah, no, I like your idea, your suggestion of we'll continually look at it, and then that way we don't have to put a set time to it, because it could be every year if we wanted to, right? I don't.
Right, but my concern with not putting a set time to it is that it could be every 10 years. To me, it doesn't have to, I mean, Ms. O'Looney, if you want to jump in, it looks like you had something you wanted to add, but it doesn't have to be the type of thing where it comes to the board as a specific agenda item, as long as staff is reviewing it and provides us with an update. I personally, I'd say either annually, biannual, or every 2 years, however, but specifying a time so that we know that someone's looking at it and staying on top of.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes,
So
of course,
sorry,
always,
from the Peter
please.
Gallery.
Jump right in there.
You might want to consider that the board will receive a regular review
Yes.
of such names for alignment.
Love that, if that works for all of you. Ms. O'Looney?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on your suggestion. I do like Miss Webb's, the board will receive, but that still doesn't give a time. The board will receive on an
Maybe just an annual.
biannual basis?
Just because my assumption would be that not much would change. So it would really be that you would just be going through, and then the board would just get, like a list saying these have still been verified as appropriate recommendations.
I think
So our office keeps the list, not administration.
Okay.
So we do a vetting before names are added to the list, and so if there are events or circumstances change about the names, we are apprised of that, and then we update the list and talk with the board about it. So I think that, I don't think you need to put a time frame in here. If you wanted more specific language, maybe in the regulation, that we would, as with the board and the board staff, would at least discuss it on an annual basis or such. Maybe that would be the place to put a more specific
I'd be
timeframe.
comfortable with adding it in the regulation. I just would like it somewhere because, there have been many names that have been suggested to us that be changed, that we be looking at, and I'm quite certain there wasn't any board who named a facility after someone they didn't think it was a good idea at the time. So, does that work? Is that fair? Okay. Does anybody have any other comments or questions or concerns? Ms. O'Neill?
Yeah, I think it's important to view this policy not just as something the board uses to think about our school names, but also something the community will look to see, if they have concerns about their school name, what are the next steps. So I have a question for, I don't know who it's for. Are we allowed to talk about the regulation here today too, or is that a separate
No, we
conversation?
can discuss it.
Okay.
I mean, they don't have it here for us but yes, I mean, it's provided, I asked that we have.
Because one thing that stands out about our current standing regulation about renaming schools specifically is that it has to go through the principal. If a school community is interested in renaming a facility, but there may be, a principal is just one person with their own opinion, and the community may feel differently from that singular individual. So I didn't know if the board would be interested in adding an alternative pathway, not through the principal, for a community to request a name change.
I'm comfortable with that, if that's something you all want to look at.
Well, I will say it was intention to address the regulation after the policy has made some decisions. So there have been other kind of guidelines put in place that aren't reflected in regulation yet, based on some recent renaming experiences. So we wanted to finish the one, see where you wanted to go with that, and then, this will certainly need to follow both the board's development as long as also those guidelines that were the lessons learned from some of the recent experiences.
Okay.
So after this goes through the full board approval process, then the regulation will be reviewed. Is that what you're saying?
That was our intention.
Okay, I understood. The only reason I brought it up is because as it stands right now, the policy and the renaming process is not very detailed as to how a petition gets to the board in the first place, right? So that's the reason I brought it up, but understood.
Great. Okay. Then next steps for this.
Would be tentative action in January.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry, and when do you foresee the process of revising the regulation to begin? After full board approval?
Yeah, I mean, if we keep moving through a tentative timeline,
Yes.
we would, final action on the policy would be May 26th.
Yes.
And then I assume that staff would be working on a regulation then and over the summer.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Moving right along. This brings us to item number 6, the attendance policy framework. Next we'll be discussing the development of a new board policy for attendance. The committee engaged in a robust discussion regarding student absences during its March 26, 2020 meeting. This was prompted by a request from our former SMOB, Nick Asante, in him asking us to consider adding mental health days as an excused absence. During that discussion, we recognized that while we have MCPS regulation JEA to regulate student absence, we're missing a board policy on the issue. So on May 25th, the full board passed a resolution directing this committee to develop a policy on student absences. And here we are. Today we're going to review and discuss the framework, and I will turn it over to you to begin that discussion.
Thank you. Joining us are our OTLS colleagues who will present a framework for creating a new policy on student attendance. The board has not previously passed a policy on student attendance. Rather, state regulation has served as the guidance, and implementing regulations have been developed to explain procedures needed to implement state regulations. Ms. Davis?
So thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Mondrowski, Ms. Evans, Dr. Daka, Ms. Oluni. I'm honored to represent Student and Family Support and Engagement regarding the Attendance Policy Development Framework. As the O in Prosper states, we are open 5 days a week for high-quality teaching and learning, one of our core values. That being said, I cannot stress enough the importance of regular school attendance and MCPS's commitment to working with students and families to overcome barriers when attendance becomes a challenge. During this presentation, you will hear a definition of attendance, its value, and additional circumstances that may prevent consistent attendance. Also, we will discuss key components of the policy. In the spirit of one Office of Teaching and Learning in Schools, we are joined in the audience by our School Support and Improvement Area Associate colleague, Mr. Koutsos. So at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Neff, Director of Pupil Personnel and Attendance Services.
So I actually think Ms. Davis is going to start.
No problem. Okay. If we could have the slideshow. Okay, and then move forward one, please. Okay, super. So just as Mrs. Mondrowski mentioned, this came from a board resolution from last spring when the committee instructed the Board Policy Management Committee to develop a policy on attendance. So the framework in your packet lays out a proposed scope of work. and an approach that staff intend to take over the coming months. So today's conversation is intended as an opportunity for conversation with committee members to clarify any changes to the approach proposed, so the staff may return at the next meeting with a draft that responds to their interests. So at your request, we have included in the packet a variety of implementing regulations that address attendance. And it was not our intent to go through them all today, but just to say that they will be part of the staff's review, and it gives you an idea of the breadth of attendance situations that this policy will serve as an umbrella for. Okay, all right, Mr. Neff?
Yes, so next slide, please. So having this discussion is a little bit like trying to hold water in your hands. It can go any number of directions. So we feel like it's important to start with what do we mean by attendance? And what we'd like to propose to you as a definition is full participation in the regular instruction to which you are assigned. So for most of our students, that's in-person instruction in a comprehensive school or in an alternative setting. But for others, it could be live virtual instruction through the virtual academy, or maybe even asynchronous instruction through interim instructional services or online pathways to graduation. But we think it's important to think about the environment to which you are assigned. Ms. O'Looney knows, and hopefully the rest of us remember, that each classroom and class has a culture and a climate that is led by the teacher's personality, the teacher's instructional delivery style, and more importantly, the interactions that happen with the students in the class. So we think that base instruction to which you are assigned is important. And so while we've discovered lots of different ways to allow students to access instruction through the pandemic and even before, we feel like there's no substitute for that assigned classroom instruction. And there's a level of norm setting that goes on in those classrooms. There's a level of cohesion that we think only exists in the day-to-day, continued day-to-day participation in that instruction, and it gets lost if students are not there regularly or if they're participating in different ways. And so we think it's important to, when we affirm the importance of attendance, to discuss what specifically we mean. You can go to the next slide, please. We do know also that there is an accountability measure, next slide please, related to our attendance. Each of our schools receives a grade, if you will, and our school system receives a grade based on the number of students that are chronically absent over the course of the school year. So, there's an accountability measure there. We also had the discussion in May in which there was a discussion of what are additional reasons beyond what the state dictates that might constitute a good and a sufficient cause to be excused. And then there was the very robust and detailed conversation around well-being and mental health. And the board, expressed their support of students needing to have the opportunity to take times during the school year in order to take mental health breaks, and without their parents having to make up an excuse that maybe did not exist. And so that is something that we want to have emphasized in the policy that we create. We know the religious observances are also ones that we absolutely want to have as excused absences when students need to miss. And then we want to think about the experiences, particularly of our older students, around interviews, work experiences, college visits, and giving the opportunity for them to ask for and receive permission to miss schools in order to take advantage of those very appropriate and very growth-oriented kinds of experiences that they experience mostly in their high school years. You can go to the next slide, please. So In addition to promoting what we define as what attendance means and emphasizing the importance of regular school attendance, we want to make sure that we have promotional activities. So we have been and we plan to continue to benchmark against other school districts around the promotion of it. We also know, and Mr. Davis mentioned it in his introduction, there at all times, but especially now during the pandemic, as we're trying to get through it, there are many, many barriers that families face and students face getting to school regularly. There's many other priorities that seem to come up around family. And so our job and our goal is to come up with interventions and supports that address those barriers, and connecting with community partners to the extent we need to, and try to remove or eliminate as many barriers as possible to allow students to, or to enable students to attend more. And so moving away from punitive or threatening approaches, truancy, going to court and things like that, and moving towards more encouraging and proactive, really with a root cause analysis approach. For any 100 attendance issues, you probably have 100 different reasons behind it. And so you have no idea of knowing how to intervene or support unless you take time to figure out why students or why parents are having difficulty sending their children to school regularly. And so that's the approach that we plan to take, and that's the approach that we would like to have emphasized through the newly developed policy. And then I mentioned we have some learnings, and we continue to get some learnings through the pandemic of things that can be done virtually and electronically. And it only makes sense to continue to take advantage of those when we can, when there are reasons why students are not able to attend the regular instruction to which they're assigned, giving them opportunities to receive instruction of some sort and opportunities to make up the work in some ways. Also of great importance in the policy should be the discussion of equity and consistency across schools. We want to make it such that there is not great variance from school to school in how they address requests or attendance issues. But while we say that, we know that there also needs to be some level of discretion from the building administrators around that. And I think about, again, thinking more about the secondary level. And if there are students who are requesting, a very high volume of absences for some of the reasons that I described, or maybe they already have some attendance issues, it would seem very reasonable for the principal to have the discretion to have that conversation with the parent and the student and talk about the number of absences and talk about whether they may or may not negatively impact their academic performance and their social emotional connections to school. So we do feel like while we within our regulations have and will continue to implement, very structured approaches, that you can't get away from discretion and judgment when it comes to individual requests. So those are sort of the broad frameworks of what we're thinking of in terms of the attendance policy that we'll be developing, and I'll turn it back to Ms. Davis for next steps.
So it is our intention to be back in February with a first draft, and then spring dates would have to be negotiated with board staff to how we would flow through that. We did not intend to walk through the framework line by line, but I certainly, we can do that if you'd like, but we are ready for your comments.
Is there anyone who's requesting that they do that? Okay, so I will skip that part and just go straight to discussion. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I know I don't need you to go through it line by line, but just a couple of things that I had. Obviously we discussed the religious observances, but also being cognizant of things like student and internships and career shadowing has been raised to us, that is not a current policy, that's currently not something we do. And then just making sure that the virtual world is, obviously equally as incorporated into whatever policies we make. I had mentioned in discussions about this policy that a couple years ago when I was having conversations about students being able to take classes virtually at a different school, a course that's offered at a different school than their own, and being able to take it. One of the things that kept coming up as a barrier to that was attendance and how it would be tracked to them. So just figuring out how we talk about that in the policy so that it's no longer a barrier and we can figure out how to work through it. Did anyone want to jump in? Ms. O'Looney?
Yes, Mr. Neff, I really appreciated what you said, and I love this term, growth-oriented experiences that our students will engage in outside or during school hours. And you mentioned interviews, work, college. One thing, and this is going back to a previous student member that I know my colleagues work with, I know Ananya Tadakonda tried pushing for civic engagement days and having those be lawful student absences. Obviously, that's a much wider ideological conversation that we should be having, but just something to put into consideration, a discussion we might have in crafting this policy. Thank you.
And we plan to. I mean, as you know, KEA has been suspended, but that will definitely be a discussion that we have as part of the development of this policy, and we'll certainly solicit your input as the board as part of that.
Okay, thank you. Again, I don't, Ms. Evans or Dr. Jacob? Okay, the only other thing I just wanted to add to was making sure that we're inclusive of the concept that even though there aren't technically excused absences anymore in terms of our accountability to the state and whatnot, that we do have things like attendance awards and stuff. So ensuring that our policy is specific about the fact that if you do take off for a religious observance, for example, that does not get counted against you in terms of a perfect attendance.
No, exactly. Like anytime we ask schools to analyze student attendance data, we tell them there always has to be sort of a human judgment component of it so that there's no automatic letters generated or meetings scheduled, because like I said, every attendance issue has a story. And so I think about a student who may have had a medical concern and missed the first 2 or 3 weeks of school. It would take 2 or 3 months into the school year before they come off of like a 10% list or things like that. And it would be completely inappropriate to continue to reach out to those families, when it's just, so the human component of looking at the numbers and determining what they mean and tell us is critical.
Yeah, I appreciate that, especially when you mentioned addressing equity and consistency among schools.
Right.
So that, because, we do hear stories about some schools are very considerate of religious observance absences and others not quite as much, and, things like that. So I know a lot of that's regulation and not policy, but just being cognizant of it as we're developing the policy would be appreciated. Dr. Daka?
I know I saw that in the material here, but you'll have to point out where that is.
The regulations?
The regulations
Yes.
about
Okay.
religion.
Uh-huh. Like I said.
Let's use it when we're electronic.
No, it's all right.
I was gonna say, it's, it's on page 4, number 7 is observance of a religious holiday. But again, that is very vague, and I just want to make sure that we're explicit on making sure certain aspects of any of these absences could be addressed at the school level as well. Okay, so does anyone have anything else on that one, on this one?
I don't know, you brought up the question about students taking a class that's not offered at his or her own school. And we've done that before, so we must have some kind of, I don't know, something that we did about that I'm thinking of. particularly middle school students who took algebra at the high school or geometry at the high school. So we must have some pattern as to how we do the attendance in that case.
Well, that's sort of what I thought too, but like I said, I was hearing from principals and stuff that there were concerns about proceeding with that type of thing because of keeping attendance, like the student being. So if you are a student at school X and you are taking a course at school Y, if that's not your school of record and you are absent, is it counted towards that school's absentees? Is it counted towards your home school's absentees? Like things like that, I think. So there's just a lot of complicated aspects.
Yeah, that seems like a technology thing that we should be able to overcome, because in your example, that class would be the regular instruction to which that student is assigned, and
Right.
so I think we can overcome that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Daka. All right, well, if there is nothing else anyone wants to add to this particular topic of discussion, we will go ahead and move on. Okay. And just for clarification, so that policy will then come back to us. You're going to bring forward the first draft of the policy at our next meeting in February, correct?
February. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so our next item 7, is policy JNA, curricular expenses of students. Policy JNA provides that all students, regardless of their economic circumstances, have full access to all courses and required instructional materials. In order to ensure that we're implementing this policy with fidelity, we've asked for periodic updates of course-related fees. So today we have our staff here to provide us with this update. And with that, I will turn it over to all of you.
Good afternoon. Scott Murphy, Director of College and Career Readiness and District-Wide Programs. I'm representing the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Schools for this update. We don't have any slides. This is just an oral update. You were provided with some materials. I believe I'm joined virtually by Dr. Donna Redmond-Jones and Mr. Sean McGee, Directors in the Office of School Support and Improvement. We work together in implementing course-related fees at the secondary level. As you probably know, and in your materials, there's been a series of ongoing adjustments that we've made over the last few years with implementation of secondary course-related fees. In 2017, a work group came together and in that year really tightened up the way that course fees were defined and tightened up the expectations for how materials of instruction were defined and provided to all students. Since that time, we've had new approval processes and much more diligent review of the fees every single year. And I just wanted to note that in 2017, there were 1,082 separate course fees at the secondary level. And in the materials you have now, there are 70. So over the last, that reflects, I think, some work that's happened over the last few years. That is, the way that that's being done is a much more narrow and prescriptive definition of what materials of instruction are. And what that means is materials that students need to access the curriculum and should be provided to all students by the school. And so that has been our emphasis over the past few years, and you can see the reduction of fees as a result. In your materials, there's a listing of the fees that have been approved for this year, the 70 separate fees that have been approved. By and large, they are food eaten in class in career and technical education classes where they are cooking, where they're working on culinary skills or hospitality programs for food that's actually consumed by the student in class. The second major area are property really for personal hygiene that becomes the property of the student, such as a hard hat in career and technical education or scrubs in the medical professions, other materials that they may wear that become their property. And the third are art supplies that become the property of the student. And so those are now the three primary areas, with the biggest being food that's actually consumed by the student in class. So your materials sort of tell that story over the past couple of years with the most recent. The most recent is a bit of a change in how this is all communicated to principals. What had been over the last few years a separate memo to principals about course-related fees is now in their annual memo about operating fund allocation. So there's a May 2021 memo in your materials that basically reminds principals that they are provided with operating funds every year to provide those materials of instruction for students, and the course fees should be very, very minimal, and by and large are those three areas that I talked about just a moment ago. So that's the story over the past couple years since we provided the last update, and I think we're just now open for discussion and questions.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it very much. Do any of my colleagues have any comments or questions that they want to start off with, Ms. Oluni?
Yeah, just super quick. Where does early college, MC squared fall into all of this?
So those wouldn't be under this umbrella of course-related fees, but for those programs for early college, MCPS pays the cost of tuition for the students who are in the early college program.
Okay, because I've heard from students that there is a grant that they need to apply to for Montgomery College each semester to pay the cost of their books and things, like $300 per semester, but
Not for early college.
not for
It's all
early
provided.
college. Okay, thank you. I guess it's not part of this, so thank you.
Dr. Daco, do you have anything? Ms. Evans? No. Thank you. I think, doesn't seem like there's any major issues. My only comment would be just, of course, always making sure that we are relaying to our families appropriately that if they need help and support with any of these fees, that it can be provided to them. So, but I'd like to think that goes without saying, but I'm saying it anyways.
I should have mentioned that. It is front and center in all the communications that it cannot be a barrier. So thank you for calling that out.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time on that. If there's nothing else with that issue, we can keep going. Is that good? Okay, well, that brings us to item 8, policy IDA, the school year calendar. So as Doug's making his way over here, as you all probably recall from our December 2nd board meeting, the calendar for next year, the 2022-2023 school year, was presented to us. But during our discussion, it became apparent that there were a couple of revisions that had been made after the calendar options were initially presented to this committee and put out for the public feedback. So, I had, in discussing making a proposed slight change at that meeting, decided that I would like to get my colleagues' thoughts on that. And so in an effort to consider and discuss the revisions and provide the public with another opportunity to respond, I wanted to have the calendars returned to the committee for one last look. So Mr. Hollis is here to walk us through a comparison of the two calendar options and highlight the differences. And just for point of clarification, my thinking was we would go through, that he would show us the two options, go through the comparisons. I thought that they would both then go out to the public for comment, but I'm not sure if we're supposed to narrow one, or if it goes back to the full board for us all to pick one. So I'm just clarifying, trying to make sure we're all clear on next steps, but I'll let you start with this one if you want.
So I can respond before Mr. Hollis starts. I believe the instruction from the full board was to return it to this committee for discussion, but that we would discuss the scenarios and then send it back out for public comment, which I believe Mr. Hollis and team are prepared to do after this meeting to give sufficient time for the public to comment before we come back to the full board in January.
Perfect. That's what I thought too. Like I said, I just wanted to clarify that. So, okay, well, Mr. House, if you'd like to go ahead and start us off, it'd be great. Or Dr. Dawson, whoever.
Good afternoon. Doug Hollis, Executive Director of the Office of Finance and Operations. I am joined today also with the Chief of Finance, the Office of Finance and Operations, Dr. Jeannie Dawson. This afternoon, just want to go over a few things, and I think you've captured most of it, so we hope to be before you quickly and out of your hair and out of your way. If we could go to the slide presentation, just for ability for us to just walk through this. Next slide, please. So here we just covered the timeline once again, which is, we began our collaboration this summer with the cross-office staff group, and that group worked, and we're able to bring some things to this committee in October. We also had an October board meeting, and we presented at those opportunities. Additionally, in November, we put the information of 3 scenarios out to the public, scenario A, B, and C, and those were commented on by the public. And then in December, just last week, we came back with the interim superintendent's recommendation and hope for action from the Board of Education. And the action that was taken at that time was actually for us to suspend policy IDA until January so that we could come back to this committee. And so that's what we're doing today. Next slide, please. Today should just serve as an update to the Policy Management Committee to capture those things, and then our future actions are to actually put the feedback and comment, put it out there to the public again for an opportunity for public feedback and comments on the options that I think we will hopefully be able to agree upon today and what I will present to you based on that previous discussion last week. And then on January 13th at that board meeting, we will have another interim superintendent recommendation and hope for board action. Next slide. So really quickly, just to summarize again, we brought forth a recommendation last week. That recommendation was similar to scenario A, but not exactly the same. And so that caused us for some pause, I think, as a board and staff members around that. And so the reality is the initial scenarios, all 3 of them that we put out, did not include a system-wide closure on Wednesday, November 23rd, which is something we did in a modification for this year's school calendar. It also did not include a professional day on Friday, April 21st, which is aligned to Eid al-Fitr. Initially, we thought that date was on a weekend, and it turns out that it is on a Friday. And so to be, aligned with what we've done in the past with such day, we needed to account for 2 more instructional days. And so the recommendation did that, but at the same time, there were some questions. On the next slide, we will highlight the details of option 1, which is the same as what the initial recommendation from the superintendent was. And then the following slide will be option 2, which actually we will highlight a little bit those differences because I believe verbally, Ms. Mondrosky was able to give us a framework of another way that an option could work. And so, next slide. So really quickly, this one is the same as the interim superintendent's recommendation that we presented last week. The start date is August 29th. Both of the calendars have August 29th as the start date. The highlights or the key areas here, December 23rd is actually a non-instructional day on this calendar, so no day for teachers and students, and you can see that on the graphic well there. Additionally, the last day for students is Friday, June the 16th. And then because of where Juneteenth falls, because that last day is a Friday, the 16th of June, the last day for teachers would be Tuesday, June the 20th. And that's teachers and other 10-month staff. So just want to note that, and that is what you see in option 1. Next slide. Option 2 is what Ms. Mondrosky really began to speak about, and this is just a visual representation of it. So December 23rd becomes an early release day instead of a non-instructional day. So you see that in yellow on December 23rd on this calendar. And because of that, then we're able to gain back the day in which we end the school year. And so the last day for students would have been Thursday, June the 15th on this scenario, making the last day for teachers June the 16th, that Friday, and then they're not impacted, or 10-month staff would no longer be impacted by the Juneteenth system-wide closure and having to come back a few days later after the last day of school. So those are really just the two options. I just want to pause there and really turn it over to you all for discussion.
Does anyone have any? Thank you very much for the description, by the way, first of all. I think you did a great job of emphasizing the differences and letting us know how we're going to proceed from here. Do any of you have any thoughts or questions or comments or concerns or with us putting this back out? For me, I think, I would like to know, get some feedback from our staff, particularly who would be the most affected by the fact that their last day would fall, kind of towards the beginning, but not the beginning of the following week after school is over. So that was really sort of one of my concerns. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts, but if not, then I'm going to recommend that we move this out for public comment so that it can come back to the full board with a superintendent recommendation and a overview of the comments that end up being received. Everyone? Dr. Daka, you okay with that? Okay, well then I will move that we go forward with our public comments on the two calendars. Okay?
Great, thank you so much.
Absolutely, no, thank you. I was gonna say.
Thank you all.
Lickety split, quick. And thank you very much for all of your hard work on this calendar stuff. As I've mentioned before, having served for years on the calendar committee as a representative for the PTAs and the community, I know that it is not an easy task, and the constant adjustments that you need to make and be cognizant of can be a lot. So thank you for your work on it and for taking the time to do this for me again. So thank you. With that, I have item number 9, which is adjournment. So unless anyone has any concerns about adjourning, no, all good. All right, then I will move this meeting adjourned.